I promise I'm going to get on a monthly schedule ASAP, but I just moved and started a new job, so I think now is a good time to debut a new idea. I thought I'd talk about a long mini-series or TV show about history. It won't be as detailed as the normal episodes I do, since then it would be pretty much longer than the series itself, as I explain every little bit of historical detail in order to fit into a broader analysis. Instead, think of these as detailed recommendations with a little bit of historical trivia thrown in. Anyway, once upon a time the British Broadcasting Corporation made a historical drama about a very dysfunctional and quite inbred ruling family. They tended to be narcissistic, cruel, self-indulgent, corrupt, and occasionally outright psychopathic. Plus, the only thing that brought them together was a tendency to stab each other in the back, sometimes literally. You might be thinking of Claudius, but, well, you saw the title of this video. We were talking about the Cleopatras. And probably one of the most notorious examples of failing to catch lightning in a bottle twice in media history, the BBC commissioned the Cleopatras, deliberately hoping to make a second Claudius. Claudius itself was just the pinnacle of a trend of successful British historical dramas, arguably starting with the now obscure but then popular The Caesars in 1968, and running through the 70s with not just Claudius, but also The Six Wives of Henry VIII, and Elizabeth R., and A Fall of Eagles. The trend stalled, as trends always do. In this case, with the Borgias. Maybe people were just tired of period political dramas, but the production of the Borgias did have a few problems, especially casting as its star an Italian actor who can only speak broken English. As you might imagine, the Cleopatras really was the BBC playing it safer than they did with the Borgias. They were going back to very old-school family dysfunction, and this time focusing on 4 very screwed-up generations of a very screwed-up dynasty, the Ptolemaic dynasty of ancient Egypt, on top of the most famous member of the family, the Cleopatra, who, in historical terms, was Cleopatra VII. Plus, the BBC brought back Philip Mackey, the screenwriter who started the whole fad by writing The Caesars. Even then, the epic 8-episode saga flopped in the ratings and with critics. But why? Before we get into the negatives, I should probably admit that I really like this one, more than BBC's The Borgias. For starters, just one episode likely has more incest, intrigue, and murder than an entire season of Game of Thrones. I mean, really, if you think that Jaime and Cersei's fictional twincest was appalling, consider that the Ptolemies in real life had about 2.5 centuries of siblings and uncles and nieces marrying each other and pumping out genetically compromised babies. See, the Ptolemaic dynasty were really committed to that whole pharaoh gig, even though they never had even a drop of Egyptian blood.
But now we have news that a revolt has broken out in Thebes.
Egyptians revolting against their king?
Against their Greek king. It's the old cry, Egypt for the Egyptians.
I'm as Egyptian as they are.
Yes, but you don't look Egyptian. You don't speak Egyptian.
Instead, they were Macedonian, and just descended from the original Ptolemy, a general of Alexander the Great. So they took the ancient practice of the pharaohs to sometimes keep marriage in the family to an extreme that would have made even the Habsburgs sick to their stomachs, and started always marrying brother and sister whenever possible. After all, they had also latched into the idea that the pharaohs were gods on earth.
Well, I don't like him at all. I like Chickpea much better.
Your grandfather?
Yes, he's nice.
With kings and queens who are, of course, also gods, it is not a question of liking or disliking them.
Well, if you ask me, she was bad.
The words good and bad do not apply. They are what they are.
So it wouldn't do just to marry mere mortals. To give you an idea of how far this went, people normally have 16 great-grandparents. Cleopatra only had 6. And yes, according to one specialist's reconstruction of her physical appearance, based on statues and coins depicting her, she had an underbite. And if looking at Cleopatra's very tangled family tree isn't enough, there's also the fact that all the men were named Ptolemy, and most of the women were named Cleopatra, something to show, like the contemporaries of the Ptolemies and Cleopatras themselves had to get around by using nicknames. Anyway, to get back to Game of Thrones, another similarity is that you might think that Cleopatras is guilty of sexing and bloodying up the source material, the same way the producers of Game of Thrones did the books. That's actually not really the case. Like all BBC historical dramas of the era, the show is remarkably loyal to the few ancient historical sources we have about Ptolemaic Egypt. King Ptolemy Potbelly getting into a war with his sister wife after he dumped her for her daughter / his niece, and sending the decapitated head of their own son to her. Historically accurate. An Egyptian princess having her own sister killed while she was seeking sanctuary in a temple, and then getting tortured and sacrificed by her sister's lover, a Syrian king. Happened. One of the Ptolemies murdering his cousin and wife and then getting brutally murdered by a mob of enraged citizens? Yep. The Cleopatra's father getting overthrown by his own daughter and then having her casually killed? Of course.
She's your daughter. I have others.
In fact, Philip Mackey said he wanted the series to be horror comic. Given how lively the stories about the dynasty is, you can get his logic. But the problem is kind of the same you get in a bad comedy. There's no straight man, or in other words, nobody you can sympathize with. I mean, Game of Thrones gets criticized for being grim-dark or whatever, but there are sympathetic and very flawed characters all throughout the narrative. To get a little closer to the mark, it's also true by Claudius, where Claudius is basically a decent person stuck in a family of murderers and lunatics. Hell, even the series' greatest villains get their redeeming moments. Sejanus genuinely loves his children, Caligula is also a victim of his own insanity, and even Livia gets a tragic monologue that wasn't in the book. With the Cleopatras, you don't really get any of that. I wouldn't say that the characters are boring, one-dimensional stick figures. Ptolemy Potbelly, as played by Richard Griffiths, is hands down one of my favorite portrayals of a historical figure in all time.
And the other great consolation I've found...
In killing people?
No, that gets boring after a while.
But at the same time, Potbelly never gets that one special moment that makes for a truly complex and great villain. I mean, he was fat and unattractive, that's it.
Nature denied me beauty, so I denied myself virtue. I couldn't be loved, so I decided to be feared.
Even Ptolemy Fluter, the Cleopatra's father, starts out as a naive and charming fellow, but practically off-screen he turns into a murderous megalomaniac who literally sells out his country to the Romans just to keep his throne. I don't quite mean all this as a criticism, at least from my own perspective. To be honest, I do find it rather funny how casually sociopathic everyone is, even if no one except Potbelly is as memorable as Livia or Caligula. But at the same time, I can understand why this was a big reason why the series flopped, probably more so than audiences just being tired of the genre. Plus, the whole production is horribly dated, even more than you might expect. First, there's the weird soundtrack that combines reconstructed ancient music with progressive rock. Then there's the CGI, early 80s CGI. I guess it's a step up from the same 4 or 5 sets you'd see in BBC historical dramas of the 70s. But I don't know, for all the superficial problems and how unsympathetic all the characters are, the writing is still perfectly solid. The dialogue is crisp and lively, the plot paces itself well despite covering about 130 years, and the whole narrative works as not just a tale of a few generations of an incredibly messed up royal family, but also the story of how Egypt went from being an empire in its own right, to being a client kingdom of the Roman Empire, to getting annexed by the Romans altogether. The way this shadow of Rome slowly creeps into the scene is handled with a kind of subtlety you don't usually see in most more recent historical epics. But what really gives the Cleopatras a secure place in my heart is that it, at least in terms of writing, gives my favorite depiction of Cleopatra, who is herself one of the historical figures I'm most fascinated by. She's not just Mark Antony's tragic lover here, or some ditzy, spoiled brat like in the HBO series Rome. She's still a seducer of powerful men, but at the same time she's more like the political mastermind and the genius who could speak 9 languages, including Greek, which is what the members of the Ptolemaic dynasty actually spoke. In fact, she was probably the first member of her family to even bother learning the language of her average subjects, Egyptian.
Does your Majesty read hieroglyphics?
Of course. Would you excuse me for a moment?
Not to mention Aramaic, Hebrew, Arabic, Persian.
All those?
And more. She can't be called uneducated.
It helps that she is the most likable out of the whole clan. Not that that's much of a compliment. But no, the Cleopatras isn't by any stretch the second Claudius the BBC hoped for. Still, in spite of Cleopatra and Antony's fame, Ptolemaic Egypt is one of the least explored areas in history, bloody and bizarre as it is. The fact that the BBC did go to that dark corner of history, and with some of their old school flair and loyalty to the historical subject matter, that alone makes it worthwhile.